Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a conflict that literally reshaped the modern world. Why World War I happened. And more specifically, the real reason it happened. Now, you've probably all heard the famous starting point in history class, right? On June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old student assassinated an Austro-Hungarian prince. But is that really why the whole thing kicked off? Okay, let's dive into this. It's kind of a fascinating question, isn't it? If we could hop in a time machine, jump back, and stop that one single assassination, would we really have prevented a 4-year global conflict? A war where, honestly, over 20 million people lost their lives, and ancient empires were completely wiped off the map. I mean, could one isolated event really cause all of that destruction? Well, as we'll see, the reality is definitely not quite that simple. To really get a handle on this, we need to shift our perspective a bit. Think of it like a giant mountain of dynamite. A tiny matchstick thrown on the ground doesn't cause a massive explosion on its own, right? It needs fuel. That 1914 assassination was just the matchstick. It was the spark. But what we absolutely have to look at is that massive mountain of dynamite that had been piling up right beneath it. Section 1. Building the powder keg in the geopolitical landscape of 1914. Let's look at how this powder keg was actually built, keeping in mind that most of Europe was controlled by ruthless monarchs with pretty much zero regard for everyday commoners. To put this into perspective, in 1914, out of all the countries in Europe, there were exactly 3 democracies, just 3: France, Switzerland, and San Marino. That meant millions upon millions of ordinary people were totally subject to the imperial whims of just a handful of monarchs. They had absolutely no voice in what happened to them. So how did this tension actually build up? Well, back in 1878, the Treaty of Berlin temporarily gave Austria-Hungary the right to administer Bosnia. But then, in 1908, they just outright annexed it. They essentially stole it straight from the Ottoman Empire. And as you can imagine, this deeply infuriated the people living there, especially ethnic South Slavs in neighboring Serbia. They had absolutely no desire to be ruled by yet another empire. They dreamed of a united, independent nation called Yugoslavia. And that resentment, that brings us right to the boiling point of 1914. The whole thing just perfectly illustrates the kind of shady backroom deals these empires were constantly making behind closed doors. It started with Austria-Hungary planning to invade and annex Bosnia. Then they made this secret handshake deal with the Russian Empire. Hey, we take Bosnia, you get the Bosphorus Strait, and nobody complains. But the Slavic public in Russia actually found out about it and protested massively. They were completely outraged their government was letting Austria-Hungary conquer fellow Slavs. So, embarrassed and bowing to public pressure, the Russian government had to drastically backpedal. Suddenly, they started heavily supporting Serbia, and just like that, the geopolitical stakes were sky high. Section 2. The true causes. Unpacking the systemic drivers of war. Because when a previously thrown bomb bounced off the prince's car and a completely wrong turn stalled the vehicle right in front of Gavrilo Princip, well, he finally got his shot. But he didn't just kill a prince. He ignited 4 deeply rooted systemic causes. Let's look at cause number 1, linguistic nationalism. Now, this wasn't about gaining independence or freedom. It was a toxic nationalism, entirely based on a sense of racial superiority and this aggressive, condescending attitude toward other nations. The rulers basically manipulated this feeling. They used it to convince ordinary working-class citizens that they were literally the absolute best in the world. And because of that, they needed to go fight and die just to defend the empire's pride. Because number 2 is imperialism, which was widely viewed in this era as the highest stage of capitalism. This was all about expanding borders just to capture other countries, loot their resources, things like gold and raw materials, and exploit cheap labor. Even famous capitalists at the time, like Henry Ford, explicitly pointed out that these conflicts were driven by a desire for raw looting and endless profit. It was just a brutal global cash grab. Now, let's move to the third cause, militarism. When we look at the military spending of the 6 great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Italy, the numbers are staggering. Back in 1870, they spent a combined £94 million. But by 1914, that number had surged by nearly 400%. I mean, when you pour that much money and resources into building massive armies and the biggest navies the world has ever seen, a bloodbath is pretty much guaranteed. They were basically begging for a reason to test out all these new weapons. And the fourth cause? Well, that would be the rulers themselves. Get this, the monarchs of Germany, Russia, and Britain. So Kaiser Wilhelm II, Tsar Nicholas II, and King George V, they were all first cousins? No way, right? It was a literal royal Game of Thrones. Millions of people were about to be thrown into a meat grinder over what essentially boiled down to a catastrophic family feud. Because of all that royal paranoia, they had built these strict, rigid alliances, which they ironically called the chain of friendship. So when Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia in retaliation for the assassination, the dominoes fell incredibly fast. It's like a chain reaction. Russia steps in for Serbia, Germany jumps in to defend Austria-Hungary, then France joins Russia, and soon Britain gets pulled in, dragging along its vast colonies, including places like India, who were suddenly forced to provide soldiers for an imperial war they had absolutely nothing to do with. The whole world was just pulled straight into the abyss. Section 3. Selling war to the masses. Propaganda versus the trenches. So how exactly did these wealthy monarchs convince poor, often unemployed commoners to risk their lives in the mud for imperial greed? The answer is aggressive propaganda. You can see the stark contrast when you dive into the history. Newspapers and official state poets, like Alfred Tennyson, sold the war as this incredibly noble profession. It was painted as a glorious, selfless duty for disciplined gentlemen. But the reality? The reality in the trenches, which was later exposed by soldiers and poets like Wilfred Owen, was an absolute nightmare. We're talking poisonous fumes, severed limbs, and soldiers coughing up blood. It was pure misery, not glory.
But, it's absolutely crucial to remember that not everyone bought into this warmongering propaganda. There was actually some massive pushback. Various political groups, like the American and Italian Socialist parties, the British Labour Party, Russia's Bolsheviks, and even famous intellectuals like Rudyard Kipling, they all actively fought back against the war effort. They saw right through the manufactured glory and recognized the conflict for the imperial resource grab it actually was.
Section 4. The human cost. A tragedy of the common man. Because when you strip away the borders and the propaganda and all those royal decrees, you realize that ordinary soldiers often had way more in common with their enemies than they did with their own commanders. Nothing proves this more beautifully than the remarkable story of the Christmas Truce of 1914. Picture this. British and German soldiers actually laid down their weapons, climbed completely out of their trenches, and met right in the middle of the battlefield. They sang together, they exchanged food, they celebrated. These guys literally had no reason to hate each other. In fact, after this happened, there were widespread mutinies where soldiers just straight up refused to fight, until their own generals threatened to shoot them for treason. This whole bitter irony is captured so perfectly in Thomas Hardy's 1909 poem, The Man He Killed. The summary essentially goes, because both were unemployed, they enlisted as soldiers, fought for their country, looked at each other, and shot at one another. I mean, think about it. Had these two men met in a pub during peacetime, they would have probably shared a drink and a laugh. But instead, the systemic greed of the era forced them into a situation where they had to end each other's lives.
Which really leaves us with a final, lingering thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. It boils down to this. If the common soldiers, the ones singing together in the trenches, had absolutely no real reason to fight, then who truly benefited from this war? It's a huge question, and one that forces us to look way past the matchstick and deeply examine that mountain of dynamite beneath it. And that's a lesson that is just as important for understanding conflicts today. Thanks so much for joining me, and always keep questioning the history you've been taught.